afternoon. Thank everybody so much for joining us today for our first FACT Lunch and Learn, this 35th anniversary celebration week for FACT. I'm so happy you're able to join us today. We have such a great speaker today, and this topic is so timely and just really on the forefront of a lot of the work that we're doing and touches so many lives today and is such a current issue. So before we start, I'm Nicole Poulin. I'm Executive Director of the Family and Children's Trust, and I'd like to take just a moment to introduce our Senior Research Associate, Taylor Hawley, formerly Taylor Davis. Taylor recently got married. Taylor, wave for the folks at home. Taylor's going to help us monitor the chat today and provide technical assistance to me, which is an ongoing service. So before I introduce our speaker, I would like to give just a very brief overview of the Family and Children's Trust, as it is our 35th anniversary week. As many of you know, FACT was established by the General Assembly in 1986 with a focus of supporting work that prevents and treats family violence across the lifespan. Over the years, we've distributed millions of dollars to organizations and programs throughout Virginia. And because 100% of the funds raised by FACT are from private donations, we have been able to provide that support in flexible ways not offered by other restricted sources of funding. FACT is a very unique entity in Virginia. It is an independent trust established by the Commonwealth, held within the Department of Treasury. All the funds raised by FACT come through private donations. The Board of Trustees is appointed by the governor to oversee FACT's work, and the Department of Social Services provides administrative support for the board by supporting the position of Executive Director and Senior Research Associate to carry out that work. FACT is a creative private-public model. In addition to supporting services, FACT has coordinated projects across state agencies, supported statewide trainings, taken a lead on researching and promoting increased understanding of the complexities of family violence, and in recent years oversees one of 3 citizens advisory committees established in Virginia to examine and address child abuse and neglect. As established through code, FACT is charged with advising state agencies and the governor on matters concerning the prevention of child abuse and neglect and family violence. So today we're here to talk about the issue of housing, homelessness, and trauma. I'd like to introduce, I'm so pleased to have her with us, Nichele Carver. Nichele is the Associate Director of the Homeless and Special Needs Housing Department at the Housing Program at the Department of Housing and Community Development. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Psychology from Virginia State University and a Master's of Science in Rehabilitation Counseling from Virginia Commonwealth University. Ms. Carver initially began working in the homeless services field in 1997 in a Richmond area shelter program, assisting families experiencing homelessness with locating permanent housing and supportive services. She then spent the next 9 years helping people with serious mental illness who were also experiencing homelessness obtain permanent supportive housing. Nichele has been with the Department of Housing and Community Development since 2007 as a program administrator, program manager, and currently as Associate Director of Homeless and Special Needs Housing. As Associate Director, Ms. Carver is leading Virginia's effort to end homelessness for all. And in the name of full disclosure, I should let everyone watching know that I've known Nichele Carver since 2007 at the Department of Housing, and she is one of my very favorite colleagues, professional colleagues and friends. So I hope that we have a really enjoyable exchange today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from her. Nichele?
So, first I was laughing because when Nicole said, at least I'm not a cat, I was a mouse in this picture. So I thought this is hilarious that she said that. So I want to introduce myself. I use my formal fancy picture. And then I have my fun picture, which is more how I act on a daily basis. And then I have this picture from the office that I'm about to lose because we're going to a collaborative space environment. But in my office, I had things up to remind me of why I even do this work. Like, why are we doing this work? And you'll see things like homes, house, healthcare. I'm sorry, homes, house, health, and happiness. Housing is for everyone, those kind of things. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I do not code switch. So that's like a really big important thing for me. And if you understand code switching, as an African American woman, typically we're expected, or African Americans are expected to speak generalized American English. Um, and that is deemed the correct English when actually um, African American Vernacular English is another dialect and is just as intelligent as GAE. However, because we are in a white dominant culture, GAE stands out as the acceptable one. I speak both. I do not code switch. I just intertwine AAV and GAE. So I want to let you know that. So if you hear something like ain't no, I fully understand what I'm saying. I'm not somebody who struggles with English. I just choose to be bi-dialectal. All right, so, and let me just tell you a little bit about me. So Nicole gave you my bio. It was beautiful, but it really stems from being a kid who grew up in poverty and had been evicted before. That was fairly traumatic. And we talk about resiliency a lot, and kids are resilient. I'm not going to say that it didn't make me resilient, but I will say that that moment of being evicted and seeing my stuff on the street has never left me. Like, that's one of those things that no matter how resilient I am, it is something that always is in the back of my mind, the feeling of it. And the other time that, because that was our housing instability period, we did experience homelessness, which I will say is rare to go from your own unit straight into homelessness. And we weren't in our own unit. We were actually staying with my grandmother, and all of us were evicted. So, and then the second experience of homelessness for me was when I was 15. And what was I, 15 yet? It was 1980. No, it was 1990. So yes, I was 15, about to turn 16. But that summer, my mother decided to move to Virginia. We lived in DC. I was a straight A student in DC. I was a talented and gifted student. I didn't want to leave. I was tired of moving from place to place. So I lied and said I would stay with my grandma. Told my grandma I was staying with my friends. And I pretty much couch surfed and slept in DuPont Circle whenever I couldn't finagle enough of a lie to stay at somebody's house. So that was the summer that I experienced homelessness. It was a pretty tough summer, but all things being said, again, when you look at resiliency, things make you resilient, but they are no less traumatic. So I want to make sure we always remember trauma stays with us. And even dealing with that kind of stuff in therapy, there are certain lessons that I learned from there that go with me every single day of my life. So I want to go ahead and pay homage to DHCD. DHCD is committed to creating safe, affordable, and prosperous communities to live, work, and do business. That's our mission statement. The statement of my unit, the Homeless and Special Needs Housing Unit, is that we are going to ensure homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. The goal of that means that we want to try to keep people from becoming homeless in the first place. If it happens, we want to get them out of homelessness and into permanent housing as quick as possible. And our goal is for a person to not experience homelessness more than one time, if they have to experience it once at all. All right, so I want to just talk about the trauma associated with experiencing homelessness. So imagine trying to do your day-to-day activities with these things on your mind. Where are you going to eat? When are you gonna eat? Where am I gonna sleep tonight? How are my kids gonna get to school? Is it safe to stay here? I can remember having that thought um, when I had to stay at a couple of people's houses that I weren't quite sure if something might happen. Was somebody going to try to touch me? Not sure if it was safe, and making the decision that DuPont Circle was safer than staying at somebody that I didn't know's house. Because in DuPont Circle, if anybody remembers DC in the early 90s, there were lots of drug dealers, all that kind of stuff. However, when you were from that community, the community protected you. And there were old guys who used to play chess, and they always looked out for me. Like, I felt safer in DuPont Circle than I had in many places in DC in the early 90s. And I know drug dealers were bad, but for me, many of them were like my big brothers that were helping to protect me and make sure I was straight. So when you think about things like, will I lose custody of my children? The constant stress and trauma that a family experiencing homelessness is going through, think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's really difficult to move up to self-actualization when you're stuck just trying to figure out your basics. And I had a friend one time who got really angry because a man experiencing homelessness, she gave him a burger. He ate the burger and he threw the trash on the street. And she was like, why isn't he protecting the environment? And I was like, why do you think he should? Like, he's trying to figure out, okay, I ate a burger. When's the next burger? Like, what's next? And you're talking about something that is a much higher up item on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I said, instead of judging him, let's figure out why our society thinks it's okay for him to stay outside and how can we fix that. So it's that kind of stuff where people are expecting folks to be at the top of the Maslow's pyramid when they don't know if they're going to lose custody of their children because they're sleeping in their car. And we need to recognize that that's a very real experience for the folks that we're working with, and to not put our values on them while they're just struggling to survive. They also, people experiencing homelessness have a higher amount of adverse childhood experiences. You heard me discuss kind of what my childhood was like. And that was just two small blips in my childhood. That is not the times that I was raising my younger siblings, because my mom had to work, and she had to work evening shift to be able to get the nighttime differential to afford to raise her three kids. That's the kind of stuff where it looks like, oh, that's great, she helped raise her siblings. But then you think about, oh, that's kind of sad that a 9-year-old was going to pick up her 2 and 1-year-old siblings from the babysitter and getting them ready for bed before she did her homework. So that's the kind of stuff. Those are very adverse childhood experiences. And then we need to think about the many reasons that people experience homelessness outside of homelessness is due to a lack of affordable housing. That's the number one thing. And then we have all of these other systemic factors like domestic violence, like experiencing trauma from your family, where staying in their household, they're not abusing you, they're just, it's not a safe place to be. It's not a good place to be mentally. It's not somewhere that you want to raise your children. Those are the kind of things that folks are struggling with and making decisions on whether to sleep in their car, or if they deem that a shelter might not be safe. Shelters in Virginia have to be housing first, like they have to have low barriers. But we also know on paper and what happens in real life is sometimes different. So I know there was a shelter in Tennessee, and I'd read this years ago, but it would not, that shelter would not take an intact family. So it was a mom, dad, 2 children. The son was 17, so still a child. And the shelter said, we're sorry, your 17-year-old son can't be here. He could be a sexual predator, basically, is what they were saying. So the son had to stay at someone else's home. And eventually he harmed himself and took his life because he thought he was the one affecting his family being able to get into somewhere safe. That's the kind of stuff where our systems harm and cause and inflict more trauma. And so at the end of this, I'm just going to give you a couple of ways that we, as service providers, as people working in the system, and I apologize, the stuff I'm going to talk about in this Lunch and Learn, I am sorry I did not do a disclaimer. We'll be talking about homelessness, we'll be talking about stress, trauma, my own personal experiences that some may feel are uncomfortable to talk about or hear about. I am 100% comfortable because it is my life, and I have learned over time. I happen to be born Black. I happen to be born to Marie. Nichele knows Marie well. My mom is a very special human. Love her to death. But this is my experience. And so I make light of it. And it actually isn't something where every day I'm thinking I can't live. I'm actually surprised I am living after going through the stuff I've gone through. All right. Was there a question? Because I saw somebody was speaking. I want to make sure, like, I'm cool with stopping for questions and everything. No? Okay. Because it kept saying Jenny Powell was speaking. So
Just also, folks, feel free to use the chat feature if you're more comfortable doing that.
all right. So I want to talk to you all a little bit about who is experiencing homelessness. Like, what are our numbers in Virginia? Because again, I think many people see folks sleeping outside, like the gentleman or the woman sleeping in the cubby hole of an office building, and they think that that's the only picture of homelessness. And I will say, people experiencing homelessness are you guys and me. Like, they're exactly like us, without homes, right? And so if you hear me say people experiencing homelessness, um, it's pretty offensive to call somebody a homeless person because nobody calls us housed people. Like, we don't get walked around saying, that's that housed person, Nichele. Like, nobody does that, but for some reason we feel like we can other a person who doesn't have a home and like call them the homeless. Nobody calls us the housed. So just keeping that in mind when you're talking about people experiencing homelessness, it's something they're going through. It's not who they are. And I think most people in here can understand the whole person first language. So when you look at, I'm using our 2020 point in time count numbers because our 21 numbers have not been certified by HUD yet. Surprise. So even though we're nearing the end of 21, we really don't talk about those numbers until they've been certified by HUD. But what I will tell you is they are so much worse than this. And this was bad pre-pandemic. Nothing has gone in a good direction because of the pandemic. So just know these numbers are prettier. And as you see, from 2019 to 2020, it went up. So in Virginia in 2020, we had about 5,957 people experiencing homelessness on any given night. Point in time count is a 1 day count of people experiencing homelessness. Some of them are meeting people outside, some are counting folks in the shelter. And the way you look at this is the multiplier would be 4.5. So to get an idea of how many people are experiencing homelessness in Virginia in a year, you'd multiply that 5,957 by 4.5. And when you look at who's coming to the system, that's pretty accurate. So out of this 5,957, 859 people were experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Again, that's the person that comes to our mind when we think of homelessness. We always think of the person that's sleeping outside on a bench or in the side of a building or in a car. That was only 859 persons out of this 5,000, out of these 6,000 roughly. 1,998 are people that are in families. That's one adult and one or more children. So About a third of the folks experiencing homelessness are part of families. Out of those families, 38 persons in those families are experiencing chronic homelessness. What I want you to understand is that means there is a family, 38 people who are part of family units that have been homeless for up to 3 years off and on, or the equivalent of 12 full months within that 3 year period. So that is a long length of homelessness. And that's something to pay attention to because chronic homelessness typically has other things. So the person has to have either a medical diagnosis or a mental illness. And also, they are experiencing these long term moments of homelessness. So imagine being a child who has a parent who has those issues and y'all are not sure where you're going to sleep. So that in itself is trauma. And I will remind you, because I always hear about how resilient folks are, and they are. That does not negate the fact that they went through a lot of trauma. It just means they've learned how to survive it. And then out of those numbers, 649 folks reported having substance use disorder. We know that's an undercount because it's based on self-report. Many people are not gonna, they don't, number one, realize they have a substance use disorder, or they're not gonna report it to some random stranger asking them questions about their lives. That doesn't normally happen. So we figure that's an undercount. We have 1,013 people that have reported that they have a serious mental illness. Again, probably an undercount because everybody who has a serious mental illness doesn't actually know they have one. Think about A Beautiful Mind if you haven't seen that. Everybody who has a serious mental illness does not necessarily know they have one. And then 548 individuals out of this count, so a little under 10%, reported that domestic violence was the immediate cause of this episode of homelessness. So that was the immediate cause. That is not counting all the folks that have experienced domestic violence in their lifetimes. This is just saying that the immediate thing that put them into homelessness was domestic violence. So I want to just talk a little bit about historical trauma because the systems that we're dealing with now are not brand new and they didn't just pop out of nowhere. So without saying, slavery is a historical trauma that as you go through the years have gotten us to this day where people of color, Black folks are overrepresented in almost every negative aspect. Shorter lifespans, Black people experiencing homelessness, less graduation from high school. Like if you take all of the negatives, Black people are historically the ones who are hurt the most by them. And Jim Crow is right along with that. Then you look at things like redlining, where you wouldn't normally see that as historical trauma. But if you can't choose where to live, or if where you live is deemed not a place to get a mortgage, or you're struggling, that is traumatic, especially when it has nothing to do with anything but the color of your skin. So to live with the fact that you did nothing wrong, and yet you are not going to be able to build the generational wealth to keep your family going. Racial covenants is along that same line. Racial covenants are traced directly to people's lifespans now. So if you look at places like the Fan in Richmond, Virginia, where there were racial covenants, and a racial covenant means in the deed itself, it says something to the effect of you cannot deed this house or sell this house to a Black family, nor can you allow a Black family to rent or live in this home. Some racial covenants were still in the book in 2020. So people are still discovering them because if your home has been in the same family since the 40s when that happened, you may not realize, if you've not refinanced or done anything, you may not realize your deed of trust has a racial covenant in there. That is why when you look at things like where redlining occurred and racial covenants, the lifespan is a 10 to 15-year difference between one zip code and another. Between the Jackson Ward zip codes and the Fan zip codes, there's about a 10 to 15 shortened lifespan. They didn't do anything for that to occur, but exist and be born Black. And then the highway system. I would encourage people to read about the highway system because it actually was built in many places through Black communities to break up Black communities. Imagine the trauma of having a community and then someone taking your home. So I always tell a story. My husband's grandmother, Granny Miller, had her home taken by eminent domain when she was young. It was taken because the highway was being built through it. And when you look at where 90, I'm sorry. When you look at where 95 is, if you're coming, I'm real bad with directions, so hold on. Bear with me. When you're coming up 95, going northbound 95, and it splits to 64, like you're going to the beach. That area where 95 splits actually broke up a Black community. And people who owned houses got their houses taken away. And yes, the government gave them some money for those houses, nowhere near enough money for the trauma, the stress, and how much it costs to live somewhere else. I bring up Granny Miller because she was young when she lost her home. And she died hating the government. As an old Black lady, I could never tell her, I was married to her grandson. She never knew I worked for any government system. We used to say, oh, Shell helps poor people. Like that's all we said. We never talked to Granny Miller about what I actually did because that probably would have ruined our relationship. And I loved me some Granny Miller. But I also recognized that the trauma that was inflicted on her by our government was not something I was going to overcome as being the love of her life. Her, her favorite grandchild's wife was not going to exempt me from her hatred of the government. And this list is not exhausted, but understand these things directly relate to our housing systems today, to our homeless systems today, and to the trauma that has been born generation after generation. These things don't magically go away because I'm comfortable financially, that I'm not still affected by things like slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and racial covenants and the highway system. So these are things that continue to persist for generations. All right. I
Hey,
want to,
Nichele,
uh-huh.
can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
So it seems like there's so many intersectionalities with all of these issues, right?
Yeah.
So you have kind of the historical trauma, racial trauma, and then you also have other macro level issues that have happened over the last 40 to 50 years. And I'm thinking with regard to some of the folks that are experiencing homelessness and institutionalization. Can you touch on the fact, like what happened at the end of the 70s with regard to deinstitutionalizing people, and then what happened in the 80s, and how did those things intersect with some of that historical trauma that you talked about? Because I think that those two things really intersect when you talk about this issue.
So not to get political, but people love Ronald Reagan, right? That's like this bellwether something or other. I will say that I was lucky enough to enter my schooling in the early 90s when we were trying to deal with the fallout from the Reagan era. When Reagan had decided, and Reagan and his crew, because it was everybody, decided we're going to go ahead and get people out of institutions and stop spending all this government money on folks and let them live on their own. What they forgot to do is add some money and some services to help people live on their own.
So can I just add this point of clarification? It was actually, because this is actually not political. I'm not being political. Policy-wise, it was the Carter administration
that started this.
They were advocating, because they were very much advocates for mental health services. And so it was the Carter administration that fought for deinstitutionalization, with the understanding that the money that was previously used to support those institutions would then be used to get people in supportive housing. And then when the administration ended, that money got reallocated. And these are all historical policy decisions, fiscal policy decisions that are empirically researchable. So that just a point of clarification.
No, thank you for that, because then you look at folks were released from mental health institutions and they were not provided the supports that were needed to help them stabilize in housing in the communities. And oftentimes, and this also is researchable, they were released in places that was not even their home. So you think about Central State Hospital in Petersburg. There were folks from Southwest Virginia that were in Central State, and then they were deinstitutionalized in Petersburg. They didn't have the resources to get back home, or think about, this is not the time of internet and cell phones and all that stuff. This is a person who now is living on the street because they have an untreated mental illness now. They don't have resources, and there's no support system set up. So,
and they may have grown up most of their life, right, in that institution.
So not even having a clue how to survive. And so when I came into the field, we were, like I said, really trying to figure out how to help people. And homelessness has been around forever, but not at the levels we've had since the early 80s. It has ballooned. You did not see a skid row like you see in LA prior to 1980. You just didn't. And like LA County has on any given night 75,000 people sleeping outside. I want y'all to put that in perspective. The Commonwealth of Virginia had about 6,000 people, and they weren't sleeping outside. 6,000 people experiencing homelessness. LA County has about 75,000 people unsheltered homeless. That is massive and scary, and all a direct result of us putting everybody out of institutions without support services. So now we're playing catch up. We have things like permanent supportive housing, where people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, who also have a serious mental illness, can get into housing, can have these permanent supports so that they can live. I mean, most of them live on their own or maybe with a roommate, but they're living as independent as possible. Other institutions, just to take a moment, the jail system, the hospital systems currently, when people are released and there's no real plan, and in some communities, the plan is the shelter. Think about the trauma of being in the middle of having some sort of major health problem. And I know if I've ever had outpatient procedures or any procedures, there's a laundry list of things you have to do to care for yourself, or somebody else has to keep you from getting sick again. That's very difficult to do when you're in a congregate shelter sleeping on a cot. Or if they drop you off, because this has happened in other states, I've seen it. I have not seen it as much in Virginia, but they've been just dropped off on the street. So now you have a person who's on the street with a wound that they have to do wound care for. Imagine the difficulty in trying to do that. So one of the things I wanted to leave you with before we open it up for questions, because I hate to talk about all these things that are wrong and then not give you some idea of how you, at least in your day-to-day world, can help people. First, we need to acknowledge the trauma that's faced by those experiencing homelessness. I keep saying how resilient folks are, or let's not forget how resilient they are doesn't mean that they're not going through trauma. Because oftentimes you'll hear, oh, that's a resilient group. That does not change the fact that it's trauma. And they are resilient, but we have to acknowledge that they have experienced trauma. We also need to make a conscious effort to not cause more trauma. There is nothing more traumatic than having to tell your story to 7 different people just to get some help for where to sleep for the night. And it's nothing more traumatic than telling your story to somebody who is not paying attention. So I can tell you there have been times where I have not been fully myself and doing direct service and had to check myself because somebody is telling me about sexual assault and I'm kind of staring off in the distance thinking about the next thing I have to do. That is the kind of stuff that we as providers have to be very conscious of and give people our undivided attention, and also limit how many times they have to re-traumatize themselves to get help from us, because our systems are set up to force people to keep being as needy as possible and tell us their stories over and over again and jump through 100 hoops to get something as piddly as something that they deserve as a human being. And allow the people you work with to dictate their own lives and make their own decisions. One of the things about the homeless services system over the decades is it's always been pretty paternalistic. And it would be a system where a survivor of domestic violence goes into a shelter only to have more people control and dictate what they do in a nice tone, and I'm helping you. But what we were doing was continuing the cycle of not letting the person going through this experience direct it. They might not know everything, but we need to put the choices in front of them, talk to them, and let people make their own decisions, even if our middle class values don't necessarily work with those decisions. And I'll use an example. If you ever hear people say, I don't want to concentrate poverty. Concentrating poverty is bad. Like, we've heard that. I know I lived that forever until we started doing focus groups and people were like, concentrating poverty is you guys' issue, not mine. Like, this is my community and you're trying to move me to a community I don't feel is safe, being a predominantly white community, and I'm a Black person, and I know what happens when you're the only Black person in a predominantly white community. I don't want to do that. I want to stay in my community. Even if you think it's filled with poverty, this is my support system. And I had to think about that because that goes along with white dominant culture. The proximity to whiteness is like, you're going to get better because you live near someone who's better. That's not necessarily true, but that's the thing that we've been telling ourselves. And I believe that for a long time. I'm talking up until a few years ago, and then started having conversations with people where I had to understand my community is Verina, Virginia. My community is fairly racially diverse, but in a very odd way. It's old white farm money and newer middle class suburbanites, right? That's what my community consists of. And I don't think I would feel good if somebody thought it would be better for me to live somewhere else so I could grow as a person in Short Pump. You know, I'm growing here. Help me grow right here in my own community. And that's the kind of stuff where our systems don't always listen to the people we're serving. And that creates this rift where we're like, well, why do they keep going back to this bad neighborhood? Because that's their community, right? So let's figure out how to help them live in their own community if that's what they choose to do. Some people want to leave, but everybody doesn't. And then understand secondhand trauma and address it. I think the best advice I ever received when I was doing outreach work was to make sure I go to therapy. And I was like, I'm good. I have a degree in psychology. I know how to help myself. Not realizing that listening to people's trauma and their stories stories of sexual assault, of domestic violence, of pretty horrific things stays in your head. Even when you're great at compartmentalizing, you need to have a source to be able to deal with the secondhand trauma, the secondary trauma. So what I'll leave you with is, if you're not doing that, and if you have a degree in psychology, social work, whatever, I would recommend you do so. We are the worst patients. I will let you know that. We are the worst clients. I think Nichele could agree, because we know so much, but we need to help ourselves by letting go and letting somebody else help. So with that, I do want to turn it over for questions, because I know it's not much time left, and I want to be able to answer any questions from anybody. And the slides, I can send those to Nichele. So I saw that question pop up. So yep.
So I feel like we could keep you all day because because you just like dumped all this like incredible information on us, and we could go down a million different rabbit holes. So I'm going to encourage folks to use the chat box if they're comfortable doing so. But I wanted to touch on so many things. I wanted to touch on about a million things. But so first off, if folks are watching this that are not familiar, that don't necessarily work in the world of homeless services or housing, and this is all new information for them, because this is a little bit of an advanced discussion, and it's hard sometimes, I think, when we're in it and it's all we think about and all we do, to have that perspective of like, if you're like working at a bank, like how do you do this stuff? So, or what's, it's just a lot of information. So for people that don't necessarily work in this field or around these issues, if I'm coming out of the grocery store and I see somebody that I presume to be experiencing homelessness, and oftentimes there's a suspicion of a substance use disorder and or a mental health issue, how should I respond to that? What can I do in my daily life at the grocery store to try and make things better and at least not cause harm?
So a couple of things. Some of them I'm going to speak from my personal perspective, and some I will speak from what you can do if you want to at least contact someone to let them know, hey, there's a person sleeping on the corner. Just wanted to make sure y'all were aware. So if everyone wants to visit DHCD's website, it's dhcd.virginia.gov. And you can even just type in the search homeless or crisis response, and a map pops up. And you click where you are on that map, and a phone number comes up as a crisis line. You can call that crisis line. Thank you, Taylor. You can call that crisis line, or you can share that crisis line with the person. Either way. One thing I would encourage folks not to do. So I don't think it's a problem to give somebody money. I just don't. And I also think saying to somebody, I'm going to give you this $5, but don't drink, is ridiculous, right? It's ridiculous. If I were sleeping on the street, I'm pretty sure I'm spending my time drinking, because I got to survive this and I have to be able to mentally make it through this. So if you don't want your money to go to alcohol or whatever, don't give it to them. But to give it to a person with stipulations, that I just wouldn't do that. I'm trying to figure out a way to, make that as plain as possible. Also, don't judge. Like, if you want to spend time talking to this person, fine, but talk to them for knowledge and just to learn something, and not to be the one that's going to save them. They might not need your saving. And they might already be connected with somebody, and that outreach worker is in the process of building a relationship. I cannot tell you how many times when I was doing outreach work, it took me a couple of months to get somebody to trust me to come inside. They don't love sleeping outside. That's a misnomer that people want to stay outside. That's rare. It's just that there are different things that make people mistrust the government, that make people mistrust the systems, and you have to gain that trust. So I would say call the number or give the number to the person. spend time talking to them, but do not preach or judge them if possible.
Okay, we've got a bunch of questions from.
Okay, and also don't stop in the middle of the street to give people money because you're going to cause a crash. Just saying, that happens far too often.
Excellent points, Nichele. So we have a great question about kind of your focus groups and kind of how you get the language that you use to talk about folks experiencing homelessness. Can you talk about kind of how often you do your focus groups? And then do you have a lived experience team that you work with?
So I will, and oh my gosh, I'm gonna try not to get too complicated.
Yeah,
So
we got 7 minutes and I got a bunch of other questions. So
right, there are 16 continuum of care in Virginia. Each continuum of care is a HUD, like a HUD designated group of folks that work on homelessness in their communities. So each of them dictate how they're going to operate, how they're going to get information. For the balance of state, which is the one that DHCD is responsible for, we do have a committee of where we're trying to attract and get folks with lived experience, both on the committee and on our steering committee. And those focus groups were actually things that were more organic that happened in communities because folks wanted to talk about their experiences in the shelter, and that's what it grew from. The other answer to the question, where you would get information, I would go to endhomelessness.org, which is the National Alliance to End Homelessness's website. But I'm also going to say everybody doesn't use proper language. I'm still talking to folks from HUD and from National Alliance that say homeless people. So everybody's not woke in this sense. They are learning like I mean, I was using the term homeless people up until maybe 4 years ago. So this is kind of a learning process, but you can correct somebody. Feel free now that you know to be like, hey, it's not homeless people. It's people experiencing homelessness. Nichele said it. All right.
So, yeah, so that's an excellent point. I think, like with all of the language changes, I think people sometimes become defensive, and I think that it's really great when we're able to be in a space of kind of curiosity and just trying to be polite and kind towards folks. And if that means changing the terms that we use in order to be polite and kind, that's not maybe a real infringement on people to change their language. Because we all used to say that. When you and I worked together, we used to talk about homeless people all the time. I mean, that's what, so much has changed. And to that point, and you got 4 minutes.
Okay.
3 minutes if we want to have a wrap up. Because I really, just a side note, you know very well because you work closely with FACT and our work with the trauma-informed care community networks. And I've thought for a long time that there is a real opportunity to connect that work. And those vary from community to community, but there's a real opportunity for us to connect the work going on in the continuum of care with those groups. And a lot of that work the trauma-informed care networks have been focused on children's issues, but we know that this is a lifetime issue. And also we all know that children experience homelessness. So I just want to highlight the fact that I think that there's a real opportunity for that. And that's right in line with FACT's work. So not to call out a locality, but I'm not doing it. Someone on the chat is. There are a lot of rules now in Virginia Beach about laws basically making it illegal to be homeless. Does DHCD advocate for laws like that? Now, remember, you're a state employee, Nichele.
Wait, you said advocate for those laws? Like, do we want that to happen?
Yeah, and that's the question, and I think we know the answer.
So, no, we don't advocate, and we assist communities in talking to their legislators and their local folks. That's what we do. Like I am trying to remember I'm a state employee. That stuff pisses me off though. Like I know that's happening in Virginia Beach, and we're working with the providers to work with their law enforcement, because we also know when law enforcement gets involved, sometimes it's not very good for the people experiencing homelessness.
So I think that that goes in line with a lot of when we talk about how this work has changed. So the language has changed a lot, and the history of homeless, services really started in the faith-based communities, and there's been a huge, huge shift in the way we see these issues and really the sociological science behind them and how we understand these issues. And so I think that, again, being in a space of providing grace to people, that there are some communities that are really like maybe 20 years behind in seeing this issue. And that there is an opportunity for us all to come together to try and help us really be more effective at handling this issue in a way that's more ethical and humane and in line with our collective morals.
And for the tickets, Nichele, I will give you the list of all of the continuum of care. And it shows their localities, because what can happen is the trauma informed care network can go and actually work directly with those COCs to do trainings, to do work. We've done a statewide training working with Chidi and some of her partners to train, just to have a conversation with our networks, our COCs.
So see, live on our Lunch and Learn, we're already networking here. So we're just about out of time. I did want to just point out that kind of facts work in this field, and Nichele, you've been involved in a lot of that work with regard to the issue briefs and your service to us on the editorial and planning committee. And I think that, the way that your program and the folks that you work with at DHCD really see these issues is really, it's, hats off to you all, because it really is in a space of intersectionality and seeing how the issues of poverty and housing and even things like childcare, affordability, and living wage all intersect with this issue. And I just really want to commend you and your team for the work that you've done on this. And I'm so proud to just, have to be able to say that I kind of knew you all when. But truly, in Virginia is lucky to have an agency like this working on this issue. So with that, I know we probably have more questions, but we're right at 1 o'clock. And I apologize to folks for any technical challenges. We'd love to have you back, Nichele. We may start doing these on a regular basis.
And I don't mind coming back and just answering questions, because I recognize that this is our world. Like, this is my world. I live it, breathe it. And my whole goal is to end homelessness. So however I can do that, whoever I can talk to, I'm for it.
Well, we appreciate you, and thank you so much for your time today. Thank you all who took the time to join today. This is going to be posted on our Facebook page. And we encourage you to share it and forgive our technical challenges. And again, hats off to everyone for being in a space of grace. So everyone have a great day, and thank you so much. Thank you tons, Nichele. You're awesome.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.